This podcast and every other podcast that I make is brought to you by the supporters on Patreon. Not only are they the reason that a very niche show like this one can exist, which will never cover its own costs because it's nowhere near popular enough, but they also get extra content. They get ad-free versions of shows, unedited versions of podcasts, outtakes and bloopers from other content, and more, of course, depending on the tier. Huge thank you to everyone who supports on Patreon, and if you've ever considered doing so because you like these shows, you find them informative or helpful in any way, go to patreon.com/Alanah. Even $1 helps. Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Video Game Writing 101. I'm Alanah, that's Georgia, and that's Jason, who are co-writers of Wayward, Strand, which is just about to come out of the day this publishes. This is going up on Monday. Yeah, so a couple of days away.
Yeah, that's scary.
Yeah, how are you feeling?
Yeah, it's a wild ride. Yeah, because we've been making this game for like close to 7 years.
Whoa.
And, yeah, for most of that time, it hasn't been just about to come out. So
That's
something
true.
to adjust to.
Why such a long development cycle?
Like I think part of it has been that like that it is kind of a bit of an experimental game, and it took us a while to like kind of narrow down to like exactly what we wanted to do. Like we had all these like really big ideas and kind of had to scrap some of them and then or kind of found some that were like really cool. So we were like, all right, we've kind of got to remake it, but now we know more of what we're trying to do. Yeah.
So,
and then the other part has just been funding. Has been a challenge.
A situation of its own.
Yeah, totally.
So for anyone who doesn't know what Wayward Strand is, as soon as I saw this and I saw it was Australian, and to me it looked very creative narratively, but you guys will do a much better job of explaining it. What exactly is it? How would you describe what it is as a narrative experience?
I can do the spiel that we're all very used to now. So Wayward Strand is a narrative game where you play as Casey, who's a 14-year-old girl, and her mother is the head nurse on the local hospital airship. The game's set in 1970s in regional Victoria, and it's set over 3 days in the school holidays where you go with your mum to her place of work, the hospital, and your role there is just to spend time with the people on the aged care ward and keep them company and find out about their stories and their lives.
I have to say, this game made me feel like maybe homesick more than anything else I've ever played, because a lot of the old people are so rude. And I was like, that's my grandma!
That's amazing.
She's just about to turn 95 and she's so blunt, and I was like, and that Australian accent, she's Victorian, lives in Victoria, and I was like, damn, it's just like I'm home being roasted by an old woman again.
Well, we sort of like, I think a lot of people's very first impression is that it's really cozy and cute, and I think it is really cozy and cute. But it was really important to us to not have these sort of cardboard cutout, like lovely grandma who's going to like just offer you tea and be nice to you, like for every character. Like there is at least one character who is like that, who's just genuinely lovely. But yeah, a huge part of what motivates us in making this game is that older folks are their own whole people with their own rich inner lives, and they've had experiences and they've had some difficult experiences, and some of them are lovely and some of them are less lovely, and they're just like people of any other age with all their different foibles and characteristics.
They are all very different and also very memorable, and I feel like that's something that's very well conveyed in the game in a very small space of time. Is it very quickly you learn this is this person, this is how I identify them, this is where their room is or where they are physically, and I feel like I was very, very impressed by that. And one thing that I know about this game, but I've only gotten through one playthrough, so I'm excited to continue to play through it and see how it changes. So you have a little clock in your bottom right corner, and it's close to real time.
Yeah, it's multiplied by I think it's like a factor of 8. But yeah.
To get through those 3 days, right? And
yeah, totally.
People will potentially be in different places at different times. So, the first thing that I did in my first playthrough was try to find the woman who was telling me about the goat, which I was like, well, who was that? I want to figure out more about what's going on there. And then maybe the second time I won't do that. I'll follow like where the head nurse tells me to go, or I'll follow a different lead. So I'm correct in assuming that every time you play through this, it's not a choice-based situation where it's going to be like this path. It is more of an open space where the narrative will unfold differently depending on where you are at what time, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah,
exactly.
and I think something that's unique about our game, and which also played into why it took such a dang long time to make, is that our NPCs don't just wait for you to approach. They've got stuff to do. They are living their lives, and so if you come past someone's room and they're in the middle of a visit from a nurse or a doctor, or they're having a meal, then that's what they're in the middle of doing. And you have to, if you want to talk to them, you have to wait for them to be done with what they're doing. To interact with them. So even if you choose to speak to the same character first, if you get there faster or slower, it'll influence what you see.
So how on earth did you guys approach writing for that? Like, is there or was there a main through line that you expected people to follow? Like, literally, what does your like Jira look like? Like, how do you plan if there's this many people doing this many different things, it can be completely missed. How do you prioritize what you're writing?
Yeah, I mean, it was just a massive, massive challenge. Like it was, I think the way, the way that I described that we ended up doing it was really in like a whole bunch of passes. So we kind of like, plot out the whole game with like just a few of the scenes written, kind of plan it out, and then do that again, as we found like inconsistencies or things that don't fit together, then do it again. And then we like wrote like a whole heap of it. And then we kind of I guess just kept doing passes through it to like every pass that we do, like inconsistencies would kind of fall away, or we'd like, figure out that, because this person talks to this person at this time, then they really need to mention that to this other person, and that can flow on into a different storyline. And it was complicated.
A lot.
Yeah.
Is there oh, go ahead, Georgia, sorry.
I was just going to say, I think there's an element of surrender to it as well. Like, I think that in a more conventional video game, or more conventional narrative video game, you perhaps know that there's like a lot of stuff that it's really critical for the player to find out, or even maybe find out in the correct sequence. Whereas for us, we're really invested in building this very rich world. And we know that if a player on any given playthrough doesn't find out this or that or the other, or 90% of the stuff, we know that the world has still been enriched by that stuff being there. And if someone chooses to replay it, they'll find different things. But there's a huge amount of narrative content, but there's actually a very small amount of narrative content that's essential for the player to find out to make sense of things or have a good time.
So how do you pick or was there a path A? Like, did you have a kind of a roadmap for what exactly those essential things were and how to dish out that information?
Well, like we basically have, one thing that we did decide on fairly early is that there is basically a critical narrative path between Casey and her mom, Ruth, who's like the head nurse of the hospital. And those that like, those mainly play out during kind of the bookends that are at the start and end of each day. And then there are definitely things that tie into that storyline that happen throughout the game, that where we don't know where the player is going to be, but we're kind of like, basically you could be hanging out with any one of these 7 different characters, and if you're hanging out with them, you're going to have a scene with them that relates to that main arc. But that isn't required for you to see that scene in order for the main arc to make sense. So that was kind of our like concession to like, all right, if we really have it just be 100% open, then there's a possibility that a player just has nothing to like anchor themselves to, or like in terms of like the narrative. But other than that, it is really like we almost actively pushed against the thought of like, maybe this is like the main, like a primary path for a player through the game. Like there's a little bit of stuff, I guess, on the first day where you get told to go to a particular patient's room, and we kind of assume like, oh yeah, maybe most players will do that on their first playthrough. But other than that, we just tried to make everything as kind of compelling and put as much time into it as everything else.
I feel like it must have been really hard to do. Like,
it's
like you have to have just sort of let yourself ignore a lot of game writing conventions, which I think is what's so cool about this game. And I actually think a lot of studios would love to do it, but it's really scary.
There's
like not knowing where anyone is going to be at any point in time makes delivering an impactful narrative a very difficult thing to do, because you can't have those, like the songbird moments in Bioshock Infinite where you're like, I know where you're going to be and how you're going to feel when this happens. And I don't know, what's the lack of control feel like? Like, is it something you're stressed about, or was it just something that you let yourselves just be engulfed in?
I think it's just that thing where we have so many different like threads to the narrative that there were other things about writing it that felt stressful, but the idea that we wouldn't know where people were going or what they would be experiencing out of the available options was actually probably exciting rather than stressful. And maybe something that helps with, this going against every rule in the game writing playbook is that I'm not a game writer, so I've never read that playbook.
That's good. I think that helps sometimes.
Yeah. So
I have a different perspective.
Yeah, I come from theater, and
it is very theater.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, great. The whole team had been really inspired by immersive theater shows, which also have this convention which fans of immersive theater love, and people who get dragged along to immersive theater by their relative hate, which is that you don't get to see the whole thing. Mm-hmm. It's like kind of the selling point, but also the weakness. But if it's what you like, then you love it. And so that's already what I'm accustomed to, is like what we would call in theater a dramaturgy of knowing how to enrich player experience or audience experience wherever they are, rather than needing to do so in a linear way.
I imagine when reviews go up, you are going to get a lot of Sleep No More comparisons, which is a thing that it comes up in the show all the time when I talk to other studios about what they want to make. People bring it up a lot. And again, I'm just so impressed that you guys did it. What was the biggest difference between what you were working on 7 years ago and what's coming out at the time of publishing 2 days? Like, what was the biggest change?
Oh, there used to be a cat.
Oh yeah, that's right.
You cut the cat?
Yeah, we cut the cat.
No.
So it kill your darlings, and we had to say goodbye to that adorable cat.
So much is different. I feel like maybe Jason, you've got a bit more of an encyclopedic memory of what in particular was different.
Was the pitch different to start with?
We've actually got versions of the game from back then, and one of the big changes was how it's gone from previously it was in full 3D, and it was almost shot like a TV show or that kind of thing. So you'd go to a room and the cameras would be jumping around, and
As Dusk Falls, I think that's the name of that game, if you saw that.
Yeah.
They actually did what are the name in the studio is? I should know. As Dusk Falls was Interior Night, and it is a game that they actually did shoot like it was a set. But then put art, so it I'm explaining it really badly. If you see it, that might be similar to what you're talking about.
Yeah, totally. And actually at that time I was getting into, because VR stuff was getting bigger, and I was like, oh, what if we shot every scene kind of physically, I'd have a Vive controller, and I'd be in the scene directing the camera as it's going, and that was I was super into that and spent months on the programming of that. And then we kind of made an initial demo, and we were we made 7 scenes, and it took us 2 years. So if we need to have 1,000 scenes or however many, we're at around about that in the final game, we're going to need to simplify this a little bit. So that's kind of where the change to side on came in, and kind of I think that Dollhouse vibe,
it was way to describe it. It's very Dollhouse.
Yeah. It was a visual change, but also just actually had such a big influence on just the structure of the game and the way that it works and everything. I'd say that's one of the biggest changes.
I guess when you first start out, you don't really know how anything's going to look, especially if it's a writing first studio. That could be really hard. You have to change a lot of stuff to sort of make that cohesive vision work. It's complicated stuff. You kind of touched on it before, Georgia, but you said that not knowing where players would be was not stressful, but other aspects were. What was the most challenging thing about writing this game?
I think Jason and I would probably have very different answers to this based on our different roles, because my role was co-writing with Jason and then voiceover direction, and Jason was co-writing and then much more on the production and technical, actually just on the everything side. Jason did the writing and the everything. And I did the writing and the voiceover. But for me, and this again alludes to, my history not being in video games, even though I'm used to having like split narratives where, audience members can go off and try different things, when you're a theatre maker, or even like in prose, which I also write, your role as the writer is to decide the one set of things that happen. So for me, the most challenging thing in writing this game is to come up with enough dialogue options to give the player a sense that they were in this world without just making it free reign. Anyone can say whatever the hell they want. And I think that we are, I think in any kind of first person narrative game, not that it's like inside first person, but any narrative game where you have the player character, there's like the aperture of how much choice the player has to influence the character that they're playing. Like, I'm just thinking about this at the moment because I'm finally playing Disco Elysium, and the aperture is incredibly wide. Like, you can be anyone as that character. Like, you can be like a communist or a fascist. You can be like a total misanthrope, or you can be very hopeful, or you can be like a feminist, or you can be like a real sleazebag. Like, it's just totally up to you. Whereas Casey's aperture is quite a bit narrower. Like, there's different versions of Casey, and we kind of talk about like one of the people in our team, Tom, anytime he playtests the game, he just like plays the rudest, bratty version of Casey that is available. So I
kept going with all the journalist options. I was always like, I'm a journalist, I'm here to write an article. And I did that every single time because I was like, as a 14-year-old, that's what I was doing. But I was like, the next time I play, I'm excited to not mention any of that and see what happens. And I imagine it can't change her as a character fundamentally. And I liked her. I feel like she's a very likable character to follow through, but it is exciting that that's a thing you can explore or completely not explore.
Yeah, cool. But even with that narrower aperture than some other narrative games, it was still challenging to know like how to carve multiple paths through the same scene, which all felt equally authoritative, so that whichever one of those paths that you end up on as a player, it makes sense with what you know about yourself and about the characters around you.
Are there challenges where voice directing is concerned with that as well? Like, I've done a tiny bit of writing on an NDA thing where it was choice-based, but everything funneled eventually back into one answer. And even writing it myself and reading back, what I would do is like read every single possible outcome so that I would make sure that the jump from one to another one didn't make the character sound nuts. And I feel like that must be very hard to direct actors to do, because you have to make sure every part of the tree still has the same tone, because what if they say something rude and then they say something polite? And I feel like loads of games suffer. AAA has a really tough time with that in a way that I did not think Wayward Strand did. I didn't feel like anyone was like, ooh, you were weirdly mad there and then you weren't. Is that a tough thing to approach when it comes to directing actors? Is that something you have to think about a lot?
Yes, it is. I think we probably didn't anticipate how challenging. I think once we were thinking about it, we came up with some really good processes, which I'll speak to. But right before we started the voiceover recording, we started looking at, okay, how do we actually like process these scripts for? And the other thing is our cast were fairly exclusively people who haven't done video game voiceover or maybe haven't done voiceover. We've got some people who've done voiceover, but mostly they had experience in either theatre or in television and film. So very much accustomed to like, my character has one thing that they say per second, cannot be saying multiple things or feeling multiple things, depending on someone else's actions. And we initially thought we would just print out every scene and just get them to read it start to finish. But as you've identified, Alanah, it's like, how am I going to say, I don't mind, and then also say, I don't want to do that, like one after the other. So what we ended up doing per scene is that we traced a path through the scene. We had the lines of dialogue numbered, and then we traced a path through the scene with the numbered lines saying, this is one entire version of the scene, and got the actors to record that entire version first that was like emotionally coherent and made sense. And then we'd say, all right, we're now going to jump back up and get line 3, which we skipped over, which contradicts line 2, and just get that in isolation. And with all of the actors, we started in that way, and some of them we continued in that way throughout their whole recording, and others got the gist of what that meant earlier on and just sort of preferred to go start to finish, and were able to just sort of like chameleonically just change in and out of emotions per line once they understood how the script was formatted.
I feel like that must be hard for actors too, like to keep an idea of who your character is and what their arc is. It's got to be a tough challenge for them as well. Just so many challenges that this presents.
Yeah.
We decided to really put life on hard mode with them.
I reckon with the VO process, it was definitely handy, like, because Georgia and I would be at most sessions, and kind of like Georgia was doing the actual VO direction and like working with the actors to get the performances and stuff. But then like, myself and also like Maze, who did the like VO tech stuff, was at most of the sessions as well. And I think having a few of us there kind of listening out for like, oh, maybe we need to take that line a little bit less aggressively so that it will flow better into the other line, like that might happen.
Is that editing process really difficult too then? Like, how do you track? I don't even know how to phrase the question I'm trying to ask. I just feel like when you have that many options, and again, you're still trying to make sure your characters are cohesive, which is very clearly an important part of this game, and could be especially complicated with elderly people when some of them do have memory issues. If you accidentally made it seem like they all did by having, disconnected tones or emotions in dialogue, I feel like that could really mess things up. Is that a really like lengthy editing process, or is more of that workload in the VO booth?
There's workload in both places for sure.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of pre-work for Maze, our audio director, and they had these enormous Pro Tools files per scene with one marker per line of dialogue, and then each scene is in a different Pro Tools file. And then Maze worked with their team to slice it up so that every single numbered line of dialogue was its own little audio file. And so, there were, that's only the tip of the iceberg of like how that was then transformed into the smooth flowing thing that you hear in the game. But it had to be taken very piece by piece in order to, flow the way that you
That's 7 years. It's making sense now.
Well, that part all happened this year.
Really?
Yeah.
That's wild. That does seem like a lot of work.
Yeah, VO in February, March.
No way. Damn. That's very, very impressive. So I'm going to ask you, Jason, the same question that I asked Georgia. What was the most challenging thing about working on this game for you?
Yeah, definitely the editing was challenging. Just trying to make sure that everything kind of fit together. And I think that's kind of where we've had a playable version of the game for a long time. And we just kind of play it, and we're like, oh yeah, this doesn't really fit with this, so we'll have to take that out or change it. But yeah, that I think on the editing side, because I do come from a programming background, so I kind of had a bit more of the I was able to apply a bit more of that
in real time. That was definitely really helpful.
Yeah, exactly. Having a bit more of that, fitting together all of these kind of logical blocks or whatever was handy. But then obviously, I didn't really have a writing, much writing experience at the start of this. So Georgia and I think just make a really good team from that perspective.
I was going to ask, where the characters are concerned, are any of them pulled from your actual grandparents? It would be tempting to do that.
No, it's where as the team, everyone in the team has really deep connections to various different characters.
That's awesome. Yeah, it'd be hard not to, I think. When you have that soft spot for the elderly, obviously, who are often not represented in video games. So it's kind of nice to see too. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to quickly say, I think that kind of ties into a thing that has been really cool on this game as well, which is that the storylines of the characters and who they are and all of that stuff. We really, me and Georgia obviously had a lot of input on that and kind of did the actual scene dialogue writing, but we developed a lot of that as a team. So the kind of 5 or 6 of us on the core team would kind of sit down with butcher's paper and kind of like go through each character's basically day or 3 days and map it out and figure out what their emotional state is. And like, so I think the characters really feel, yeah, not only very influenced by me and Georgia, but also by the rest of the team, which is really cool.
How big was the team?
Yeah, there's kind of like, 6-ish or so of us on like the core team. But then because there's so many different bits that go into this game, like animation and like all of the different like sound effects for the characters' movements and all of the different little bits that need to go into a 3D fully voiced game. I think we've probably got around 30 or so collaborators that have like come onto the game at various moments, sometimes for just a few weeks to like make a particular like set of props or something, or and then other people being on for like a couple of years doing animations or whatever.
I did love that you had the credits very early, and also that it just says developed by. You see a little bit more of that more often. I think it's a really good thing to do.
Cool.
Yeah, I assume that includes for people who only worked on the game for a couple of weeks, right? Like that. It's just seems so much nicer than making people have to like grovel for a credit, which is just such a gross, weird thing the industry does. Like, and again, having them first, I was like, that's a really nice touch too.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think it's a bit of a team philosophy thing that we just, we don't really see it as, you worked in this game the whole time, therefore you had like like a gigantic impact on what it is, and everybody else didn't. Like, it's very much, somebody might have come in and just done that couple of weeks, but the game is like, I think, fundamentally different because of their like contribution, and it couldn't exist without them, basically.
It's a very good idea. So what do you both hope that people, when they can play it, like, it'd be great if you had different answers, but I'm not going to force you to do that. What do you hope people take from it?
Do you have anything on the?
What do I hope people take from it? I hope that. Gosh, we've spoken about this so much, and now that it's like so close, I'm like, wow, I'm just like,
I feel like your perspective changes when it's the week it's happening.
Yeah,
it's real.
Exactly. It's like I think I've been able to answer this question really confidently in the past, because I'm like, release, that'll happen eventually. But now people are really going to play it next week, in like under a week. Something that I see in this game is a moment in time in Casey's life, which I think is a moment that happens to everyone at a very different age, but that does happen to everyone, which is the moment where you realize that, and for some people this happens very, very young, for some people it has to happen very young, for some people it happens much later, realizing that the adults in your life aren't about you, and don't like exist for your benefit. I have some friends here in Melbourne who do like this arts project where they get kids to dress their parents up for a portrait, and then they take the photo. But in doing the dressing up for the portrait, the artists ask the kids, and it's targeted very narrowly at sort of like 10 to 12-year-olds, I think, or maybe 8 to 10-year-olds. They ask them things about their parent. It's like, what does your dad like doing? And kids will say some stuff like, dad likes picking me up from school. Or whatever. And then it's like, what does your dad like doing when you're not around? And it's like the first time this kid has like considered, when I'm not around, my dad is
that's
like,
such an interesting project. Okay. That's cool.
Yeah. But I think our game in a very different way is sort of like, it's like the next level of recognition of that, of like being around older people and seeing just how rich their inner lives are. So I suppose it's a very long-winded way of saying I hope that it inspires curiosity in people about particularly older folks, but also just like the adults in their lives generally, especially for our younger players, but really for people of any age. Like, I think the characters that are in our game, whether it's because they're older, whether it's because they're hospital staff, they're the kinds of people that you typically kind of see for their function before you see for themselves. And I hope that it inspires curiosity in people to sort of like go into their own life and be like, oh, I wonder what my grandma's doing right now while I'm not around, you know?
That's a very interesting answer. I've been, interviewing devs for 10, 12 years now, and I've never had anybody say anything like that before. Like, usually it's, hope they connect with it or they think about their mental health, but the idea of wanting people to reflect upon other people more as humans is a very, very interesting answer. And you're right that I think it can do that, and that I have this habit of looking at my grandma as, she's old, she's gonna ask me the same question 10 times, and then I never sat down and asked her what her childhood is like or whatever, until last year, where I was like, what was it like growing up when you were poor and you couldn't afford a potato? I hadn't even thought about it. It's a very interesting answer, and you could make people connect with their families very well if that's what goes down. How about you, Jason? What's your answer to that?
Yeah, I mean, definitely what Georgia was speaking about is a big thing for me. I think there's also a very particular kind of element to the game, which is about because you can play it multiple times and kind of follow different characters into into a particular scene. You can kind of follow, one character into a scene one time you play, and then the other time you're spending time with another character and follow them into that same scene. I think, kind of an extension of that is thinking about how people interact with each other and how people kind of have their perspective and view on things, and people might have an argument or have a disagreement or whatever, or just bounce off each other in a really weird way. And if you are only able to see one perspective of that, you'd be like, oh, that other person is just a jerk or whatever. But in Wayward Strand, you can actually follow both people into that, and I think it makes any interaction like that feel complex and interesting, and kind of you can understand both perspectives depending on who you followed into it. And I'm really excited for people to find that stuff and kind of realize I guess it feels like that's the thing that we gain when we lose in storytelling techniques, the ability to control the player's path through the game. We kind of gain this ability for the player to find these moments where they can discover for themselves these interesting things about perspective or whatever.
Definitely, yeah, and it can make you introspective in a lot of ways, and that's definitely a thing that I consider to usually be a strength of video games as a medium, is because you're actively causing the story to happen, especially in a game like Wayward Strand. I think it can make us a lot more empathetic, a lot more introverted once we leave. Introverted is not the right word, but I'm forgetting the word that I want to use. Introspective.
Introspective, yeah.
When you leave that experience, which leads me into a question that I love asking people. What do you think? I'm going to phrase it this way for this particular game. What do you think that games can learn from theater and vice versa? What do you think theater can learn from video games? It's a tough one.
Yeah.
I think it's part of why this is tough is that theater is huge and video games is huge. There are so many different ways.
Such different audiences in a lot of cases,
Yeah, but even within video games and even within theater, such different audiences. Because I've been thinking recently about how video games like Wayward Strand, but a lot of other video games as well, seem to be interested, especially recently. I think some recent releases are interested in bringing us inside the perspective of someone who you would have a difficult time finding them showcased in some other media, like in a play or in a TV show or whatever. And it seems like there are some video games and some game studios and game makers at the moment that are interested in narrative games that are about marginal perspectives. And I think the theater would do well to do that, but I don't know if that's something that is a characteristic of video games. I think it's an affordance of video games. I think video games can do that very effectively. But yeah, I think.
You think it could be more challenging to share those kind of perspectives through theater?
No, if anything, I think less challenging because, for whatever marginal perspective that you're putting forward, you can have bodies in the space. And you can have someone who has that lived experience, who is on stage, who is, you know, sharing of their own experience and communing with an audience in real time. I think I can say actually one thing that I feel pretty confidently that games can learn from theater, which is like writing that's good. I hope that our writing is good, and I aspire to that. And you know, I don't want to shoot our own horn too much. That's for the audience to decide. But so many video games that are so interesting in so many other ways seem to have this very like schlocky kind of approach to dialogue in particular, which feels unnecessary. It sort of feels like the time for that is over, and you've got like, you know, all the voiceover talent in the world and all the writing talent in the world out there. And I'm sure that any given playwright or screenwriter would beat down the door of any video games company if given the chance. So just like, yeah, writing that's good.
I think the problem is just a lot of those video game companies go, we can figure out the writing later. We're trying to get the combat or the level design, and that's where the problem lies, is like the amount of people and the way that different studios prioritize that stuff. It is a problem. And like video game writing in a lot of cases is very generic and bland, and sometimes not even written by writers. It's just written by, you know, whoever had to do the level design for that particular level. And I really also hope it changes. Like a lot of it's just so generic in a way that like, we know we can do better. The studios just have to prioritize doing better. It's painful that like the amount of people who work in video games who say that too. We're all acutely aware of it and just like, oh, God damn it.
I think that's why with Wayward, when we were like, all right, we're an indie game, we can do things in the way that we want to, we were like, all right, well, our like initial core team needs to have a writer on it, like Georgia, and also like an audio person, Maze. Like they were there from basically day one or whatever, on the project and kind of influencing it. And I think that has been just such a great way to work, that it wasn't like we've built up this whole thing and then right at the end we're bringing in a writer or bringing in an audio person to just like add the audio bit. I can't even imagine
how those writers feel. Like I do have friends who worked on projects like that where, you know, they were hired late and there was no writing, and they were basically, their direction was basically, hey, make a character exist in this level. And you're just like, based on what context, and also like they have a limited amount of time and they're not allowed to add any new cutscenes. Like it just, such a mess.
Wild.
Yep. Jason, to ask you the same question, is there anything that you feel like video games can really learn from other mediums or vice versa outside of better writing?
I mean, it's like, I think kind of like a confidence in like personal storytelling, and I think that's something that we're trying to do with Wayward Strand, is to go like, we're telling stories that are personal to us and meaningful to us, and that is like, we believe that will make it engaging and interesting to other people. And like for me, a really big influence on Wayward Strand in terms of writing is like short stories. Like I really love like podcasts like the New Yorker Fiction Podcast or whatever, where writers are just like, you know, reading their short stories or short stories by other people. And in that medium, they're totally unafraid to just be like, this is something that's like meaningful to me. It's set in the small town that I grew up in, and there are characters that are based on the people in my life, but they just know that is going to resonate with other people because like, you know, the personal is universal, or like whatever that kind of phrasing is. And I think in games, maybe we're a little bit scared of doing that. Like where there's still a bit of that thing of like, oh, I don't know whether that's going to like my personal thing is going to make this too niche or whatever.
Yeah, maybe it's also that like we think that's not what a video game is. Video games, action, war, zombies, demons, totally. And maybe it's still like trying to take the risks and step outside of that more and more and get more personal stories. I have this tweet. My tweet drafts fade, and I'm like, I should tweet that at some point. That's I just wish that people would stop saying that video games or games events are going to be bigger and better. What if we just did better? Not everything needs to be bigger. Can things just be better? It's like every time that I get a game, like I look up all the time that website. It's How Long to Beat, I think it's called, and how long things are. And the minute something's like 6 hours, I'm like, thank you.
Yeah.
It's gonna be more very good, concise video games, but the marketing behind video games is still very dubstep, bigger, better, higher scale. It's like going straight for the end of the MCU rather than giving the personal stories that they gave beforehand. And I think you're right. That is a thing that the industry feels afraid of because it feels like it's not right for video games. But obviously everything is. That's the beauty of video games. Anything can be anything. But I definitely agree with that. I had a question I was going to ask based off of what you just said that I've now completely forgotten. I should have written it down. You said something that I was like, "Ooh, that's a good thought," but I've completely forgotten what it was. It happens sometimes. Oh yeah, it was about short stories. I was going to say, do you have any recommendations for short stories? I always love hearing people's favorites.
Yeah, one of the short story collections that that I feel like really connects to Wayward Strand for me is Stephanie Vaughan's collection called Sweet Talk, and that's just like it's a collection where several of the stories are kind of based on her childhood growing up in like military bases across like various parts of the US, and I like that's an example that always pops into my mind because that's such a specific experience that like very few people in terms of like percentage of the worldwide population would have shared, right? Like growing up in these military bases and stuff, and the feeling like these kind of particular emotional things about having to move school all the time or whatever, but like they feel so like I feel instantly connected to the characters and what's going on. I don't know. There's a bunch. I really like Stephen Millhauser, and like there's quite a few short stories from him that I really enjoy.
So write that down because people tend to like recommendations on this, and I don't read enough short stories. I give it a shout all the time. My favorite short story is Those Who Walk Away from Omelas. Which I absolutely love, but I just need to take more time to read more short stories.
For sure.
Well, the podcast that Jason recommended of the New Yorker Fiction podcast it rules because it's they have writers who are themselves writers who get published in the New Yorker, but that writer then goes back through the archives and picks a short story by a different writer, reads it out in full, and then discusses it with the fiction editor of the New Yorker about like what's good about it.
That's such a cool idea.
It's basically like a masterclass in writing, like every episode. It's so good.
Yeah. That's awesome. Is that a weekly show or?
Yeah. Oh, no, monthly, I think.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
that's
sorry.
Very cool. That's a very good shout. And that's the thing I also like to ask people on the show. If you have any recommendations, like what are some of your favorite pieces of writing, things that have inspired either of you?
Well, on the short stories thing as well, if people listening to this podcast are themselves writers or interested in writing, I've just finished reading A Swim in a Pond in the Rain is what I think it's called, by George Saunders. And this is the best book on writing of all time.
I've never heard of it.
I haven't read them all and I don't care. This is
That's awesome.
What specifically did you feel was so good about it?
So the premise is that George Saunders teaches a course at Syracuse on the Russian short story, and he's tried to condense that whole course into book form. So I think he says in the book that typically in the course he teaches 20 short stories, but in the book he teaches 7, and he includes each of the short stories in full and then like a roughly 20-page essay after each story, talking like sort of dissecting it, looking at what works and what doesn't. Yeah. Good. Yeah. I've done, between training in screenwriting and training in playwriting, I've done so many different like creative writing seminars or whatever. And there are some things in this book that are so fundamental where even though I really liked the places I trained and I learned a lot, there was a part of me that was like so mad that this book that's like $25 taught me so much.
Is it about writing or is it about the business stuff? Like obviously like, everyone talks about Save the Cat, and I do feel like Save the Cat is useful, but it's useful for the stuff I didn't learn when I was studying writing at university, but still not actually useful to me as a writer very much. It's more about business.
Yeah, it's not about the business stuff. It's about the writing stuff. But I think his focus in that book is like, if I was to try and distill down what I took from it, it's like just keep revising forever. Like obviously at a certain point you try and get something published or whatever, but just keep going back and keep going back. And he just has this really great way of drawing your attention to the level of the sentence. Like so often we're trying to think about like, what's the arc of this story or whatever. and he draws your attention to that, but via the medium of like what's going on per sentence, and do you like it or not? It's kind of as simple as that. He basically is just like, read the sentence. Is it good? Does it please you? Does it make you want to read the next sentence? If not, there's work to be done.
Interesting.
And then he sort of has a lot of wisdom in talking about how that relates to the broader structural elements of the story.
I mean, it is a good point that, like, when you say keep revising, that terrifies me, because I'm a person who revises my own paragraphs the minute they're done. Like, way too much. Like, it's a real problem, but I guess, like, when it's down to, like, making sure each of your sentences has a point and leads to the next sentence is something that you can definitely get caught up in when you're like, oh, I need to explain how this saddle was made over 20 pages. Aragon. Like some of these books I read as a kid. I even had trouble reading Tolkien as a kid. Like The Hobbit's the first book that I ever remember finishing, but I had trouble with some of the Lord of the Rings because I felt like some of the descriptions were too much for me. I was very young at the time, but I think even that's a balance of like, a lot of people love those books, obviously, and I still do, but it was very inaccessible because of the amount of detail that was put into how one tree looked. Yeah, and that's the thing that's like, you got to pick and choose what you like to write, and obviously he liked to write that. Oh,
yeah,
dog's barking at something. But I think that it's also like the biggest thing that I tend to say to people who are trying to get into writing at all is to just make sure that you enjoy what you're writing and you like your characters. I think that can be a thing where if you don't like your protagonist, you're not going to want to finish anything you write. You have to like them and care about them and relate to them, obviously.
That was actually that's just made me think, when you say like your characters, it really makes me think of Wayward Strand, because we have things about most of the characters that are unlikable, but at the end of the day, we were always like, I know I was, and Jason, I'm sure you were as well, just like chasing this feeling of glee. Like, even if I know that such and such a character is like incredibly pompous, like what's the most pompous that he can be? Like, having fun getting to inhabit that and being like, if I was this guy, how would I be the most this guy?
Yeah, that's true. You can make it fun to inhabit the negative characteristics that you don't like as well. And I mean, that I think is a huge writing flaw that video games fall into all the time, is making perfect characters. Like all the time. It's just like clearly hero fanfic, like masturbatory. Like, give me something that's wrong with them or something not to like about them, because that doesn't make them unlikable. It's that makes them relatable. It makes them human. It makes them more digestible. And it can be really fun to write as well, for sure.
Yeah.
It's like what Miley Cyrus said on Drag Race. People want to relate to you and no one relates to perfect.
It's true. Yeah. In the great words of Miley Cyrus.
My favorite writing teacher.
Do either of you have any other like suggestions for like go-to suggestions for people who are watching or listening at home who want to get into writing?
Suggestions for people who want to get into writing. I think beyond any specific suggestion, just like go as wide as you can. And like if you're in the bookstore or if you're on the Steam store or whatever, and you see something and your first response is like, ugh, not that, just try and push against that response from time to time. Like, follow your pleasure as well, and like engage with the things that you love, because that is also instructive. But just allow yourself to be surprised. But like as I mentioned before, I'm playing Disco Elysium, and it's taken me so long to play it because it just filled me with such immense distaste. Like the look of it, and like I even played, I think maybe 5 minutes of it, and the fact that he just comes off as a real asshole initially, and he's just like this, like completely irresponsible, misogynistic, whatever. I was like, I don't need this. I don't need to engage with this game to experience misogyny. I live on planet Earth. But I decided to go back and I said, no, people really talk about this game. It's time to like really find out what's here. And there's stuff there that's very, very worthwhile, and I'm having a great time.
That's a thing I don't do. That's a good tip, is consume things that aren't in your alley. I do not do that currently. I go, not for me. I don't have enough time, but I really probably should.
And people too. If there's people in your life who you feel uncomfortable relating to, just like do it anyway. That's
think
like
about why, and that is an interesting tip, and it can definitely open you up to different kinds of characters, different kinds of storytelling, and I definitely agree that makes you a better writer for sure. Jason, do you have an answer? Your tip for people who'd like to get into
Yeah,
writing?
yeah, you mentioned the Ursula Le Guin short story before, and she wrote a book on writing called I think it's called Writing Down the Bones.
Mm-hmm.
And I read that during Wayward's development, and that was like really, really useful. Like just a really good kind of like thing where it like kind of prompts you to do a whole bunch of writing, and I think that's something that like,
I think I had
you
that
know,
book back here. I'm pretty sure it's in that
yeah.
stack of books.
Yeah, exactly.
It
Yeah,
is good.
it is really good. Yeah. But yeah, I think that was the main thing that popped to mind. Yeah, it's tricky because you can always like there are so many of those kind of books and you can get caught up in reading them instead of actually writing. But I think that's why that book is really good is that it like is just constantly prompting you to
It's almost
like
like having a
now
teacher.
go away and write something.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. It's
totally.
very good. On the last episode, Tim was talking to me about free writing, which is not something I've ever tried before. He was like, I highly
Yeah.
recommend just you just sit down and just write for an hour and never stop and never edit anything
Yeah,
as an exercise. And I've done that twice since, and I was like, wow, this is really good because it also teaches me my specific patterns that I wasn't aware of, things that I repeatedly
totally.
write or like rely on, or words I use too often, in a way that like I will be fine to edit, later if I'm looking back at something. But if I can edit
Yeah.
them in real time, that seems much more efficient. I was like surprised at how often I was using the same words and like the same sentence structures, and I was like, oh wow, that was actually a really really helpful exercise.
Totally.
And
Yeah.
yeah, I think like general advice is just read a lot. Like everybody says it, but there are definitely people who don't think that's important, and I would argue against that very strongly. Reading
Yeah.
definitely helps.
And find a writing group. That's the other thing that I would say is,
Oh, yeah.
and it can be online. It doesn't have to be people that you know personally. If you do have people you know personally who are creative writers, great. But I think that having like writing is such a solitary thing, and there are those of us who like have chosen it for that reason, but there are also those of us who love it despite that reason. And if you're someone like getting advice and getting input and getting feedback from other writers can only help your
Yeah,
writing. So yeah, finding a writing group somewhere, either with your own community or online,
I have
is
one on Discord.
incredible.
We just use Discord
Yeah,
and we share writing
totally.
with each other every week, and it's like very very helpful to read other people's stuff all the time when it's in a drafty state too. Very easy to
Yeah,
find. I'm sure they have Facebook groups and stuff for that as well.
yeah.
Mm.
It's
Very handy.
it's so good to see other writers drafty stuff and be like, oh yeah, everybody starts out with crap, and then you just improve from there. And like that's just
Definitely.
the writing process. Like that's such a freeing thing
Maybe
to
except if you're
discover and
Stephen
realize.
King, who apparently
Yeah.
just golden from the jump, writing 10 books a
Yeah.
year. Jesus
Yeah.
Christ. That guy.
Be nice.
Yeah. Should only yeah, we're only counting actual humans in this.
But when it comes to, say somebody's already very interested in writing,
Mm.
when it comes to actually trying to get a job in the industry, it sounds like you both have pretty different backgrounds as far as writing is concerned. What would you say to people who, have maybe already been to university, have already taken all the writing classes, are already doing all of the stuff to make sure that they are good writers? How do they approach getting work? If you have any tips for that.
Mm.
It's hard.
Yep.
I think this is going to sound pragmatic and maybe even a bit depressing, but like surrender to having a job that's not writing, at least for some part of it. Like, think about what else you can do that will bring you some amount of like joy or interest in your life. And the thing is that thing that's your day job, which you initially consider to be like a burden that's just there to earn you money and that you want to one day get rid of, will actually, if you're any good and if you have like an attentiveness to the world around you, your day job can be such a rich source of like
Give you shit to write about.
inspiration. Yeah, exactly. And
Good
it gives
point.
you a broader life experience and makes you a better writer to have had experiences other than being a writer, which is an incredibly unrelatable experience for most people. And then I also think I've been thinking recently about like how there's kind of a real strategic art, which I don't think I'm a master of. And I think you sort of have to think about day by day of saying yes to everything initially, and then unlearning that skill at a certain point. Like saying yes to everything in a way that's going to help you meet people and expose yourself to new ideas and whatever, but then realizing that you have to unlearn that skill in order to narrow your focus on any given opportunity or experience to like write something that's a bit more substantial.
I've still not figured that out. Any tips?
Yeah. No, me either. I know I've gotten far enough to know that's what one must do. I have not yet done it.
Yeah.
It's a start. We're all still trying to figure it out.
Yeah.
Jason, how about you? Any advice for people who are actually trying to get work as writers?
Yeah, because I reckon, for people that have purely just writing jobs in the industry, they are like, that kind of thing is a little bit like, a unicorn or whatever. There are those people, but so many of the people that I know that do writing in games also have other skills in games, and it kind of like, you might be a producer and a writer, or you might be a programmer and a writer, or you might be, something else and a writer, and kind of like having this is a very practical thing, but like having more that you can offer as opposed to like I'm just into writing and that's the only thing that I like and I'm really good at it and I don't do anything else. It's like I think it's just way more likely if you've got a diversity of skills that somebody's going to go like, oh yeah, we can bring this person on. They can be doing this when we need writing. Like they can be doing writing. They can do this when we don't need writing, because there are like significant stretches on projects where the writing is like done or like, whatever it is. So kind of like, thinking about
in general in a industry that's so competitive like video games. It's just making yourself as employable as possible. Right? Like,
totally.
Making it so that, for the thousands of writers out there who are unemployed, who want jobs, that there's something on your resume that automatically gives you the one up on somebody else. Like when I was getting into journalism, I also took a photography class so that I knew that I could be the one to go take photos of things, so that was an extra, benefit to an employer. And then I volunteered on community radio because I was like, outlets these days like podcasts. So I started doing that. Just the amount of things that you can stack up to make you stand out, I think, is great advice. Like it feels unfair that we have to do that. But when there are so many people who really like writing and so many and so few jobs, I definitely think that that's really good advice. Make it so that you're the best applicant outside of experience, which there's not as much you can do about, unfortunately.
And I think it shows that you have like adaptability as well. Like if you're kind of somebody who's like, oh, I just write and that's the only thing that I do and I haven't built up any other skills, it kind of feels a little bit like, if you're coming onto this team, are you going to kind of be a team player and do what needs to like kind of adapt to the situations that we're in and that kind of stuff. Like I think there's, as well as the employability thing, there's also, that's something that as somebody who's hired people in the past, I've kind of thought about. It's just something to consider as well.
I definitely think coming in with and how I can serve the team as many ways as possible is a very appealing thing for something as difficult as making a video game.
Totally.
The other thing that something that you were just saying, Alanah, made me think is that like another thing that I would say to anyone who's interested in writing is don't compete, which is hard because you really internalize the lesson, especially if you're in something like a creative writing program, and especially if you're in one that's really vocational. You get force-fed this message of like, these people in the room, they're your competition and you have to be better than them or whatever.
No, they're people you can learn from.
You can learn from them. And also like if you see an opportunity that comes up for something, share it in your WhatsApp with the other people in your class. And like be like, if you see like journal submissions open and you're like, oh, I'd like to publish in this journal, but I actually know like Olivia writes this stuff that's perfect for this pitch, send it to her, be like, this sounds like you're writing. Because when anyone gets success, there's like, it builds success in your community. Like anyone who, whether it's you or whether it's someone else, if you come up and you get opportunities, that gives you access to professional networks and resources, which your community by extension then also have access to. So you're taught to think that like there's exactly one job and the best writer will eventually get the one writing job. But in reality, like success in your community leads to success in your community.
It's also definitely a thing where, I still think like having that mindset makes sense when it is a really competitive industry to get a job in. That the people who act that way in terms of like, I'm going to take this opportunity, even though clearly this other person I worked with might be better for it, or like deserves it more, or could make more of an impact with it. Those people actually don't survive. I think you get told that when you're in school, that if you want to be number one and you're acting like you're going to be number one, that'll lead you to the top. But generally, it makes you a really bad team player. People won't recommend you for things. People won't like working with you. And I think game development, like, I've been in AAA for 2 years now, and I would say more of my job is about working with the team than it is about writing.
Exactly.
And sure, I have to write, but that like hours of my day, it's much more about a team working together to make cool shit and less about sitting down on my computer and writing by myself. Like that's very little of my job in the grand scheme of things. It's a lot of meetings. And so even though I do think that we get told to be competitive and cutthroat and all that, is like this idea that you get maybe from films. Again, I do think school kind of does that. Because people don't actually succeed. They get weeded out very, very fast, especially when the games community specifically is quite small. People know each other.
Totally. Yeah, for
and
sure.
Yeah, you do definitely benefit from, like, especially now, I've been in the industry 10 years total, and the amount of friends that I have who are, like, in executive positions at different companies who are all juniors at the same time, you remember those people, and you recommend them for people, and you're getting each other work at that point, and, like, you know, it just keeps growing and growing and growing and growing and growing, and I don't know. There's no point burning bridges, and it's a common mistake that people make when they're starting out. Unfortunately. Good advice across the board there, I think. Is there anything else that you guys wanted to touch on or add or say to people who'll be playing Wayward Strand this week?
Yeah. Oh, no, you go ahead, Georgia.
I don't know. I think something that we sometimes talk about with this game is like, if you have the opportunity to play it with someone, that's really nice, especially in an intergenerational way. Like we've been thinking that this game would probably be of interest to people who, and we're finding that this is true, like even just in our own lives and anecdotally, it's of interest to people who haven't played video games before or think that they're not gamers or like wouldn't play a video game. It's a really perfect thing. So if you're someone who already likes video games and there's someone in your life, especially like a parent or a grandparent who's like, oh, video games, not my thing, play it with them. Because I think it's, you know, there was a point in time where people thought that cinema was a gimmick. That's where we are now, you know, and I think that video games are coming out, or have for the last sort of 10 years or so been coming out of that phase of like, but there are still people who, you know, for very good reasons think that it's all like blood and gore and violence and gimmicky sort of like boy stuff. Just play it with someone in your life who might be interested to see what else a video game could be.
Great tip.
I think for me, like, just one of the things that I'm really excited to hear from people about is just how the game made them feel, like how it all worked out for them, because you know, at the end of the day, it's like we've put a lot of work into it and a lot of it's quite like polished and stuff, but it's still fundamentally this like big experiment, I feel. And kind of, I'm just really curious to hear, like, does the experiment work for people? Like, is it, you know, is it doing what we think it's doing, where it is kind of opening up these like really interesting new avenues of storytelling? And what of all the stuff that we've put into the game are they finding, and all that kind of stuff.
Are you going to watch Twitch streams and YouTube videos and all that stuff?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah,
Super
going to be like
exciting.
glued to them. Yeah.
I can't even imagine how you're both feeling right now. It's a wild spot to be in.
Yep.
Well, congratulations, and thank you so much for chatting with me today. Is there anywhere that people can find you or anything that you want to promote other than Wayward Strand coming up this week?
There is nowhere anyone can find me.
That's a good bet. Keep it that way.
I do not have social media. Perhaps I should. I have a website, georgiasimmons.com. But yeah, this game is absolutely the main thing I'm promoting right now. How about you guys?
Yeah, I'm similar. I've got like a Twitter that I post on like once every few months, Jason_Backer, but like, yeah, just the game is the main thing.
I guess I never actually asked, where can people find it? What platforms is it on?
Oh yeah, it'll be on like Steam, and also on like PlayStation 5, PlayStation 4, Switch, and Xbox One, and Xbox Series X and S. Yeah, so a lot of
got them all.
Yeah. We just decided to to do them all.
It's good for accessibility. Thank you guys so much for talking to me today. Congratulations again. Thank you everybody for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.
See ya.